you please confirm? Okay, now that the YouTube is already set, I hope all of the teams are ready as well. Welcome to the third place playoff of our 2021. I am Masako and I'll be your MC for today's live stream. A gentle reminder for fellow debaters, we encourage you to uphold the sportsmanship that has been highlighted by the IREC 2021 guidelines and also had been stated in the technical meeting session, as we are trying to provide all of the participants the best comfort and also hospitality to make sure that everyone is having the best IRAC experience and that they can enjoy themselves inside of this competition. Without further ado, I would like to yield my time to the chairperson of today's third place playoff, Erika Mega. Erika, the time is yours.
Thank you, Masako. Welcome again to the third playoff round of IREC 2021. My name is Erika Mega as the chairperson of this debate, and Anissa will be the timekeeper. The motion today is this House believes that the general economic policy of countries should aim to increase gross national happiness rather than standard economic measures, for example, gross domestic product. Acting as government, we have SMA 2 Tangsel B, with Ms. Johanna Magrita as the first speaker, Ms. Aisyah Kemshanaya as the second speaker, Mr. Muhammad Sultan as the third speaker, and Ms. Johanna Magrita as the replay speaker. Acting as opposition, we have Smadisda A with Mr. Yasril Surya as the first speaker, Mr. Narendra Nizam as the second speaker, and Ms. Eleanor Cordelia as the third speaker, and Mr. Yasril Surya as the reply speaker. The panel of adjudicators consists of Ms. Ratno Anjani from UGM as the chair, Ms. Anissa from UGM, and Mr. Tere from UGM too. Before we start the debate, I would like to remind everyone in this room to maintain order and keep silence during the debate. Please only unmute yourself when it's your time to deliver your speech, and don't forget to mute yourself when you're done. And please do not leave the breakout room before I close the round. Now to open the debate, I summon the first speaker of the government, Ms. Johanna Magrita.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, imagine being rich, living in a house, but still being sad because you have no friends or family that looks after you. Panels, from here we can see that happiness is very subjective, where you there are other kinds of happiness that economy just can't compete with. Therefore, our side prioritize gross national happiness. Our mechanism is here in life to prioritize happiness rather than being very or extremely rich as a country. Secondly, we think that we don't have to specify what policies or measures that we want to talk about in this debate, right? Because we think that that's already there, like the policies. And then we also obviously going to apply a very heavy check and balances to prevent bad things like corruption from happening. And check and balances will also prevent making false data by putting laws or policies, for example. And thirdly, this debate is the likelihood of success, because we think that everything that government do will obviously have a result, right? By that mean the question then become which one is so much better. And also gross national happiness is based on happiness of every citizen, right? Whether they're privileged or not, whether they're a kid or not, meaning that our benefit or our end result will be beneficial for everyone of their identity. Now, going on to my first argument about why happiness index should be prioritized. Firstly, being rich doesn't guarantee happiness. As I stated in the status quo, being rich just doesn't make you happy. When being rich or having a stable economy doesn't guarantee the fact that you're going to be happy, this matter of having to be rich becomes vain and just not as important. Therefore, we believe that increasing the gross national happiness index is more important, because the main goal becomes making the citizens happy and not raising the economy of the country. Since the demand of the people will change too. Our side recognizes what the citizen needed the most, and we won't waste time on doing things that will be considered unimportant later on when we're prioritizing into fulfilling what the citizens needed the most, which is happiness. Second, about why happiness should be prioritized, because because that's what our citizens want, right? The citizens' interest is to be happy, and you have to fulfill that interest because they pay taxes to you, they trust you as a government, and you have to regulate that based on their interest since it's their money and that they work hard with you need to follow their interests because that's what makes you government in the first place, right? That is actually to rule and to make a better place or a better nation or a better country. And what define a better nation is if they are happy or not, meaning that we should actually follow the citizens interest to be happy. Under their side of the house, even if they have fulfilled or reached for the economics measures standards, the citizens, the people will still demand and ask for more since their richness and money won't be as valuable as laughter and happiness. Therefore, the effort that they're making to achieve economic stability will be irrelevant and considered unimportant later on. Under our side, we won't need to take longer time to actually fulfill the citizens' demands, and we're giving them what they really needed in the first place. Now, going on to my second argument about the extended benefit from happiness. Firstly, how is happiness going to affect productivity? Panel's mood is going to affect how you're doing, right? How you do things. For instance, when you're mad, you're going to do things roughly or your respond to things will be rude. This is what we picture. By actually prioritizing happiness, it will also bring benefit on the country's economy and on the productivity of the citizens. How will this happiness improve citizens' productivity? Firstly, as I said, mood guarantee how you work, right? How you're doing, and it just affects you as a whole. By focusing more on the happiness, citizens will be happier, right? If they are happier, then they can be more productive, which means it lessens their laziness because they will be happy to work, happy to help, which will then better the economy of the country too. Next, with being happy, they'll have a clearer mind too, right? They won't be distracted by other things, and they can work more nicely, and so they become more productive. Our side not only going to bring benefit for the people's happiness, but also their productivity, which can affect the country's economy as well, meaning we're actually benefiting both sectors. Lastly, how it's going to be beneficial for both rich and poor citizens. Panels, when a country or state government focus more on the economics of a certain country, the benefit they get from it won't reach a bigger scale of the citizens rather than focusing on the happiness. Why? First, even if a country's economic is already good and they have a good amount of capital for their citizens, there will still be people who are upset. Why? Because the competition will be higher, firstly, because people will compete as to who has more money, who's richest, and who's poorest, because they focus on the economy, yet they still have to find ways to be happy since their happiness is not yet fulfilled. Second, about how this will affect the poor. Under their side of the house, maybe yes, the rich will still be happy because they have money, right? They can provide for the things they need and want. Therefore, they are capable of actually being happy. But what about the poor ones? They will see other citizens being happy, being rich, but they can't be happy too since they don't have money and they don't have the same amount of economic stability. But they can't be happy too because it's not what the government prioritized at the first place, resulting to just a side of citizens that get happiness and just a side of citizens that get the benefit from it. We can't just pay attention to a side of society, but we should prioritize both sides because it matters the same. Because we're under our side, we're going to serve justice and happiness because it's the only thing that can reach both sides of the society. We're giving fairness so that every part of society can actually receive and experience the same things. Panels, for all those reasons, I'm very proud to propose. Please side with the government team. Thank you.
The first speaker of the government spent 6 minutes and 48 seconds. To respond the case of the government, I summon the first speaker of the opposition, Mr. Yasril Surya.
Hello, this is audible.
Yes, you are audible.
Right. PR preference, please use the chat box because it will be very useful. Gender pronounce your him, starting my speech in 3, 2, One, ladies and gentlemen, we agree with the government team observation that happiness is indeed what we truly sought after, right? For example, the happiness of the entire mankind and etc. is indeed what we should strive for, right? But we believe that the concept of happiness in itself, the very abstract concept of happiness, is very much not only it is subjective, but it's also the fact that it's a very dynamic, ladies and gentlemen, too dynamic and too subjective, for example, to the point you are unable to really make an economic decision because it's not only it depends on emotion, it's always changed daily. Not only maybe in one day you are being happy, but in the next day because you're sad under no really real circumstances. It means that the economic policies of this kind of countries within the government is going to change every day and every then. It means that under the Rebuttals, there's going to be no comprehensive any kind of improvement simply because it changed the plans too much to the point that they're unable to execute all of them, right? This is not what we wanted. We wanted that every country has clear-cut plan, clear-cut goal, that is the GDP and also Human Development Index, where the rating in itself is based on the economic performance of the how much of your citizen is able to produce in terms of income and etc. And also Human Development Index and how they are able to access education and also how they are able in free and other kind of things, which is what we base on our measures in order to approximate this kind of very abstract measure of happiness using objective materials. And of course, this kind of policies will of course still applies. The existence of happiness will still also be addressed by other kind of policies. For example, not through general economic, but also social policies and other kind of thing that is going to be addressed by the other ministries. But let's talk about why this kind of thing is applicable only to economic, right? No rebuttals, all of this going to be integrated under my argument. Going to be two arguments is my speech. Number one, talking about why, talking about this, how ideally a standard should be created and how it should be aimed to begin with. And secondly, talking about how under the house, this kind of happiness, quote unquote, happiness of the people can still be achieved using this kind of our standards of this objectivity like GDP and also Human Development Index, right? Firstly, talking about why, how ideal standards should be, right? We believe that the ideal standard parameter is about how, number one, it should be clear cut to everyone. It should not be biased to any one factor specifically, and it should be clear cut and also measurable in order to make it predictable in the future about how the government can make policies based on that. And secondly, is about how this kind of standards should be also towards the fact that it could be used by everyone and also by every country to react upon, right? Firstly, talking about the fairness in itself. We believe about the concept of being objective in itself, right? We believe that the concept of happiness in and by itself that is set by the Gross National Happiness Index, especially those that is set by the government team, talking about how, basically you need to interview everyone into this kind of country. We're talking to them, what makes you happy and what makes you not happy, right? We believe that it's very much unfeasible talking to everyone in your country simply because asking them is not only is subjective, ladies and gentlemen, because the rich happiness and also the poor happiness is going to be different. For example, the rich is only happy after you gave him certain amounts of money or even gave him a trip to Disneyland. But in comparison, the poor should only be happy after you give them a small cup of rice, for example, right? It proves about how dynamic this kind of things, how different this kind of happiness usually be based upon, right? But secondly, it's about dynamic. That how it's going to change over time, right? We believe that it's because the concept of happiness in itself is very much contingent about how the mood of you in that day. It creates a very subjective. It's only create a very dynamic changes within this kind of policies at the end of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, while it sure may sound good that policies that change, that means good, it can adapt to any kind of the other thing, but we believe that there's not going to be a real plan that can be drafted by the government at the end of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, for example, in one day, the entire population, for example, in order to be happy, they want to have. But secondly, talking about fairness to begin with, right? We believe that the concept of happiness in this case, in order to make your people happier, is indeed too contingent on developed country, ladies and gentlemen, and thus not really viable to being a good measure to begin with, right? Why is that so? Because we recognize that the requirement for you to happy, ladies and gentlemen, generally are about how much facilities you are able to provide towards this kind of countries. And exactly those countries that have, for example, like having good education and etc., and also having practically unlimited budget, they will always score highly, right? Meanwhile, those kind of countries like Indonesia or even Zaire, another kind of poorer countries, they are unable to attain higher achievement at all, simply because they need to improve everything. For example, education, for example, food, and also civil rights and etc., which a government cannot do all of the time simultaneously. This enjoyment, the government need to focus on one specific things, right? And why this is important? Because we believe that the most important aspect is about confidence, right? About how this kind of government able to attract investors, for example, able to secure confidence for the future, right? If we take a look at the world of government, because there's so many parameters to be fulfilled, it means that the progress of improvement is going to be slower. And other kind of investor, for example, from big countries, would not be interested simply because for example, this kind of progress is too slow. In compare, at least other side of the house, by focusing on GDP, for example, economic policy, by attracting more investors. Oh, look, our GDP is growing. We can also attract more investors, and this kind of fund from the investor can be directed to other kind of thing to improve the likelihood of other kind of factors at the end of the day, this enjoyment. And lastly, talking about how underserved the house, we are able to improve happiness simultaneously too, right? By focusing on economic policy, by growing, for example, trying to focus on GDP improvement, it means that we have also to crank out our production. For example, we'll hire a lot of more people to work in our factories and also exploit our natural resources. There also will be growing demand from the society in itself that works, for example, because they are now having greater wages simply because the GDP is growing. It means they also demand for higher standards of labors to begin with, right? And it means this kind of thing will slowly trickle back, ladies and gentlemen. And there's no actual need for us to suddenly have everyone to begin with, to have everything to be improved upon. We need to strategically count one by one. This is why we are very proud to oppose in this debate.
The first speaker of the opposition spent 7 minutes and 14 seconds. Text in the case of the government, I summon the second speaker of the government, Ms. Aisha.
All right, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. It is the government's job to make sure that their citizens are okay, that the citizens are working very well. And happiness doesn't always come from money. It is simply because perhaps meeting their parents, in which is they are restricted to do because they have to do work, which is something our side solves. Okay, so first, before coming into my extension, I'm gonna have a few rebuttals in my speech. Firstly, they stated about the ideal standard should be clear cut to everyone, yet they don't want to listen everyone in the country, which is something that a good government should do. This sounds wrong to us because we will listen to just. This sounds wrong to us because a good government would want and try to listen to everyone, not just go and generalize everyone in the same level. So under our side of the house, we will just listen to not just the majority, but under our government, we will also listen to the minority. So therefore, this win-win solution happens better under our side of the house. Secondly, they stated about fulfilling everyone subjectively, which is coming on from happiness. So opposition, please find the difference between needs and wants of a citizen. Is going to Disneyland a need that is so urgent that the government should consider the society to do? Or is that a want that belongs to society? Of course, for this, the government will consider the main needs first, which is the primary economical needs the society needs, such as food, a house, clothes, and healthcare necessities. Now, coming to my extension, we're going to talk about what happens if you don't stand by the happy index. Firstly, beginning with the fact that under their side of the house, there will be no index simply because whether they are doing well or not. This will just simply lead to people overworking themselves because there is no certain policy or standard whether they are doing great enough or not, whether they are already satisfied themselves and their company or not. Even under their side of the house, there is a certain target or goal that they should achieve within a few days or a few weeks or a few months or a few years. It is still likely that these people will still be overworked. However, with our side, this will just be a much more better since the standard, the policy, this target, and or the goal is within our own satisfaction or satisfaction that is agreed within the group of individuals. So with the idea of having a target or a goal or a standard or that you can feel relief about, this is just better to think about when you're working in the office. Even if it's an overtime session in the office, you will still feel less stressed to catch up on your deadlines since the standard is your own or something you partake in agreement about. Since they don't have an actual parameter on what is satisfaction, they will simply try to satisfy other people instead, and this will lead to desperation that will lead to many people doing the wrong thing. This could likely happen because under their side of the house, even with the target that is just a standard generalized for everyone and generalizing their needs on the same line, it will still push people to do those things under stress. And just like what I've stated before, And people who work are just not just those in the middle average class, but also the lower class that lives paycheck to paycheck, deadline to deadline. And with this in mind, it will raise a potential crime case because people will be desperate to find money and fulfill their needs, even with the job and occupation they have. Even the office worker that lives paycheck to paycheck, that money itself, it does not guarantee his happiness, right? And perhaps he wants something more. And to get that something that he desperately wants, he will do the wrong thing, because even under their side of the house, they could state that the people won't be this desperate, but desperate leads people to do those things. Since we're talking about the society as a whole, including the smaller communities that are still lacking in fulfilling their own primary basic economic needs, which is a sad thing to acknowledge. Secondly, with this matter, the government is most likely to focus on the country's general needs, but with the happy index, the country and government will most likely also focus on the certain part of the country. In this case, we're talking about the minority groups and communities. Since the government will only focus on the big numbers, for example, how many stuffs A is needed in the country, when the other side of the country, stuffs A also needed, there's also stuffs B that is also needed by the community. On the other side of the country. Yet since they are a minority, they will not be much heard from the government, and since they are most likely to be a very small numbers comparing to the majority of the individuals in the community, their needs will not really be classified into the standard economic measures, into the standard economic measures. However, with our side, we will put people's needs in general, and we will put what people are needing for their basic primary economic needs, to not just those in the majority, but also numbers of minorities in the country. So under our side, we also involve the minorities under our government too. Thirdly, also with overworking those people, whether they are rich or not, whether they belong to a high class or not, they will still feel the need to just disappear. So in this case, we're going to talk about suicide. With overworking people, they want to have freedom, and the idea of freedom, and just not doing work and not counting their days from paycheck to paycheck, and with the and not counting their days from paycheck to paycheck. With the idea of overworking them and them having suicidal thoughts, which leads to suicidal cases, the government will just lose more human and man-made resources in their country, in their community, in their society. So what if there are great people with great minds and ideas of building more innovations and inventions for the country, yet they're overworked, filled with suicidal thoughts? This is important because how one lives in this problem that is just living from paycheck to paycheck is suffocating itself. And if we're talking about the idea, if we're going to talk about being rich, which should be the idea of happiness itself, but why would you want to be happy about yourself being rich when the rest of the country is not happy? The rest of the country is overworking, or when the people around you, your friends, are not happy. So even on their side of the house, they could say that the society is progressive and understand better in mental health issues. But even when we're talking about mental health issues, anyone can get it. It doesn't matter if you're old or not, since age doesn't guarantee if you are mature enough, or if you have or whether you will get a mental health diagnosis or not. Also on our side, and also about mental health, this will still be on a conflict on our side. We also say that too. Yet we will minimize this because since the standard is based on their happiness, their own standards, and a happy country is a productive country, and a productive country itself is a happy country. So paddles, please think about the lives of the people we're talking about. We're talking about the human life that are working hard under the country, about the minorities, not just the majorities. So for all those reasons, please side with proposition.
The second speaker of the government spent 6 minutes and 37 seconds. To extend the case of the opposition, I summon the second speaker of the opposition, Mr. Narendra Nizam.
Hello, is this audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay. For PI preference chat box, for gender pronouns, let's hear him, or no genders is fine. Give me a second to rearrange my rebuttals for a second. Um, starting my speech in three. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gents, before I move on to my rebuttals, a couple of things I need to point out here. Right? I think that the main uh, thing that needs to be explained by governments out of the house is that they need to explain why this kind of gross national happiness index can actually be applied to every single country, right? Because all of they've talked about is, how, when you focus on happiness, you can cater to society. When you focus on happiness, you focus on the demands and the wants of the people, and so on and so forth, right? They talk about, healthcare, they talk about mental health, they talk about all those things, right? But what they fail to realize is that these kinds of betterments, for example, towards infrastructure or healthcare and so on and so forth, it needs money, ladies and gentlemen. It's not cheap to actually be able to supply these kinds of things to every single person and make these kinds of things available to every single people in your country, right? You need to explain why even in very poor or even still developing countries, this kind of gross national happiness index, which can only be fulfilled when you actually have enough resources to actually make your people happy at the end of the day, is actually going to be more important than, for example, GDP as an economic policy, which is actually going to encourage more growth, encourage more infrastructure, encourage better, for example, facilities for the people to use, and so on and so forth. Right? I think that in this debate, what we focus about is the economic policies of the countries in the world, and we still believe that in general, the most strategic economic is still one that focuses on the economic growth, because for economic growth, it doesn't, for example, is a possible worker, is a possible person that can contribute to the economy, and hence everyone is still treasured at the end, right? Let me explain to you why this kind of gross national happiness index cannot actually apply to every country, right? Because here's the thing: number one, as you all know, happiness is subjective, right? But economy, because it is based on numbers, is very definite at the end there, right? Some countries are just far poorer than others, right? And in order for you to make people happy, you need to have good economy first. You need to actually be, for example, a stable government with enough money to actually grant the wants of the people, right? This is not very possible, especially for developing countries, right? Gross national happiness cannot do this. And for example, you cannot build extra facilities, you can't build better healthcare if you don't have the money to do so, right? GNH, or Gross National Happiness Index, is only possible with countries that are already available enough, they're already capable enough economically to fulfill the demands of society. For example, Denmark is able to do that, Norway is able to do that. But what about India? What about the Middle East countries? What about even Indonesia at the end of the day, right? We don't think that this can actually apply to every single country, but then that GDP is far more inclusive at the end. This is very important because it shows you that GDP is far more inclusive and actually, as a general policy for all countries, more strategic at the end. Moving on to my rebuttals, right? When number one, um, when government claims that, we're going to focus the happiness of the people in the country, we're going to basically fulfill all of their basic demands and so on and so forth, right? Few responses. Number one is that government mechanism we think is very simple, which is, as government, you basically bow down to the demands of the society, right? For example, again, they want healthcare, they want proper infrastructure, and so that their people are happy at the end of the day. But what they fail to realize that these things are not cheap at the end of the day. In the end, you still need to focus on GDP to make sure that you actually have enough cash for all these things and for all of the wants of society at the end of the day, right? We think that at the end of the day, GDP also brings your country more influence and more respect at the end of the day. Let's take the examples of, for example, China or South Korea or even Singapore at the end of the day. 30 years ago, their basic lives or their basic means of life were very miserable. A lot of people were in poverty and so on and so forth, right? But now, because of the recent boom in economy, for example, how they've been working very hard for the past 10 years, for example, right? Because they focus more on economic growth, they have become developed countries. They have become very influential countries in the international world, right? The benefits of this is that there's going to be more encouragement of, for example, product trades or even knowledge treatments at the end of the day, right? And especially with a good growing GDP country, what happens is that as you get more income every year and as your economy becomes more complex every single year, you're also able to, for example, actively improve the environment. You're actively able to improve the infrastructure around your citizens, and also at the same time improve their wants at the end of the day, right? Compared to, for example, countries that focus more on, gross happiness index, right? For example, countries, we think that the only ones that actually do take advantage of GNH is, very small European countries like Iceland, Norway, and so on and so forth. their countries are very stagnant at the end of the day, and the only reason why they're able to survive using, for example, GNH more in comparison to GDP is simply because they have very small populations in which the variety of the people there, the way of living, the income, and the varieties of jobs in those kinds of countries are very, very similar to each other, ladies and gentlemen. But unfortunately, not every single country is as convenient as these kinds of countries, right? Many countries have many different kinds of races, different kinds of different paying jobs, and you as a government, in order to be able to supply proper care to all of these people, need GDP in order to make sure that you have enough cash to actually be able to supply every single one of these people, right? This is very important because at the end of the day, it shows you why GDP is actually more inclusive at the end of the day. Number two, when government claims that, oh, people will be overworked and so on and so forth. Firstly, we don't think that this is that important of a point because there's still laws around workers' rights that are actually rapidly improving and so on and so forth, right? But moreover, if you compare under their side of the house, sure, maybe there's possibly less work hours under countries that use GNH, for example, right? But since then, these countries, because their workforce is not as efficient, then these countries cannot also supply proper economy. They cannot also supply proper countries at the end of the day. This is also very important, especially for countries that are in need of these kinds of facilities, right? Not every single country has the proper healthcare and so on and so forth. They need these kinds of things, and to use that, they need to use GDP. They need to use economic growth as their base set of economic policies, right? Moving on to my extensions, how these kinds of economical focus towards GDP is actually going to result in better standards of labor, which is actually going to attract more investors at the end of the day, right? Able to prosperize their society. We are very proud to oppose.
The second speaker of the opposition spent 7 minutes and 30 seconds. Now for final response toward the opposition, I summon the third speaker of government, Mr. Muhammad Sultan.
Okay, I'm going to set my timer first. Am I audible?
Yes.
Wait. If you want to overview, I just unmute yourself. I'm going to start in three, two, one. One major assumption that there's a house keep bringing in this debate, how economic policies is easier to achieve. Few response on why this is untrue. Firstly, if that's the case, then hundreds or thousands of poor country already rich right now and already significantly improved, right? Like literally right now, most or majority country prioritize their own economy rather than their own citizens' happiness, but they still in fact poor. They still in fact underdeveloped. So there is no certainty of how like economic policy is easier and how it's easier to achieve your end result. Secondly, it's untrue because when it comes to economical policies, is that it's circumstantial, right? Like yes, happiness change, but economical policies activity and certainty of result is based it's also going to change or based on whether or not you have the resources to start with, right? Like if there is going to be a problem, like the problems are going to attack the economy of a nation, for example, like how did you even think the economic policies is easier to make when you mention infrastructure that are need to be built 5 years or 10 years, for example, when you mention good human resources that are very hard to build and to have with because you have to build billions of dollars of education infrastructure. So by that itself, all of their assumptions that are basically like saying that economical policies, which is like basically their whole main context, is very untrue, and we've been this debate so proud to propose. Two main questions I'm going to bring in my speech. Which side of the house have the best strategic approach? Secondly, which side of the house is going to make the citizens more happier? First argument. First question about which one is more important, economical or happiness. Firstly, we told you that happiness should be prioritized because being an extremely rich country doesn't guarantee happiness of your own citizens. Secondly, how you need to follow your own citizens' interests, which is happiness, that are already explained by the first. What their side of the house talk about how their side of the house saying that it's inexplosive because the GDP is growing, therefore their side of the house going to bring happiness. This is untrue because you said that it's objective how it change how it change often, right? How in any way that you are able to make the citizens happy just because the GDP is growing, while there is subjectiveness and objectiveness exists. GDP or the money also going to be distributed on many things, right? It's not going to be directly on your citizens. It's not directly going to be the poor or the underprivileged people. It's not going to be like that significant anyway. So basically, at the end of the day, under your side of the house, you need to be very rich too. You need to be as rich as America or Finland, for example, in order for you to make your citizens happy in this economical policies, for example. But secondly, talking about their whole premise, but it's toxic for developing an underdeveloped country because it's harder for them because because they have like a limited capital, for example. Firstly, we said that this is untrue because when it comes into this situation, developing an underdeveloped country already have the interest to increase the happiness index in the first place. What does this mean? Because when it comes to country development, like what this country actually want is actually going to make the citizens happy, right? Just because it's a country development and in terms of economy doesn't mean it's actually are going to make the citizens sad. Why? Because when now they can have jobs and have money that are going to make them happy, like access to food's easier because their country is developed, it's going to make your citizens happy. So in the end of the day, under ours for the house, we are still going to be in fact develop this whole country by like prioritizing the happiness, for example, but like trying to approach the very big problem first, like for just like what my first already told you. But secondly, just because in economic policies doesn't mean that it's not going to make people happy, right? That yes, people would still work, but since we prioritize happiness, there will be heavy check and balances where you are not going to be overworked, for example. Meaning that under ours for the house, there is still policies that are going to improve the economy anyway. But secondly, and what do underdeveloped countries want? They want country development. But the thing is, country development is basically what makes people happy, right? Like there is so many countries that are already that the reason on why like the most countries that have like the happiest citizens ever is actually developed countries because they actually trying to prioritize the happiness first and like they actually
Recording in progress.